Back in 2019, I graduated with my master's degree and moved to this rural area for my PhD. My dad and I decided to buy a house together. Figured it'd be a good investment since we could rent it out once I was done with school. The house was in a pretty quiet neighborhood, just a block away from this little dive bar where my dad quickly made friends. Everyone at the bar kept telling me how lucky I was, how my next-door neighbor was the nicest guy ever. They made him sound like a saint or something. So, I met him. And yeah, he seemed nice enough. We exchanged numbers. His idea. Just in case I ever needed anything. Harmless, right? Or so I thought. Literally, the day my dad left to go back home, the texts started. He messaged me while I was out, saying he'd left a gift for me on my front porch. That was weird enough, but then he started using pet names like Sweetie and Cutie. When I got home, I found this hand-painted feeding dish for my cats in my mailbox. It was a little odd, sure, but I figured he was just being nice. The next day, though, the pet names kept coming. I decided to set the record straight. I told him I wasn't interested in anything romantic. His response? A rambling text about how all anyone ever needs is friends, and how he just wanted to be friends with me. I figured that was the end of it. Spoiler, it wasn't. He kept texting me, all the time, inviting me fishing, telling me he'd left more gifts on my porch, just constantly trying to get my attention. I didn't want to be rude, so I'd either ignore him or reply that I was busy. I had no interest in hanging out with him, but I also didn't want to make things awkward since he was my neighbor. And then one night, I got a text from the bar manager down the street. She told me, "If your neighbor knocks on your door tonight, do not answer." Obviously, I was like, "What the hell?" She went on to explain that my neighbor had walked into the bar with a hatchet, claiming he was hearing voices that got louder as he got closer to the bar. He even threatened to kill someone if the voices didn't stop. The bar staff called the police, who showed up and took the hatchet from him, but they didn't arrest him. Apparently, he was on meth. The bar manager was so worried about me that she picked me up, and I spent the night at her house. After that, I did my best to keep my distance, but things just got weirder. One day, I walked out to my car and found a dead squirrel right by my driver's side door. It was obvious it had been run over and then moved there. I just stepped over it, got in my car, and left. When I got back later, the squirrel was gone. Not long after, I got a text from my neighbor. "Someone or something put a dead squirrel in your driveway. Don't worry, I moved it for you." Someone or something. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was him. Another time, I walked outside and noticed an unspent shotgun shell sitting on the bricks in his front yard. When he came out, he told me it was a warning for anyone walking between our houses. At this point, I was doing everything I could to avoid him. I'd make up excuses or just ignore his texts completely. I didn't want to be rude, but I was done. Then came the Halloween casket. One day, I saw that he'd built this giant wooden casket and written on it, "Here lies the last son of a bitch who played mind games, November 2012. What the actual fuck? He was still texting me too, as if everything was normal. At that point, I decided I was done being cordial. I stopped responding completely. Less than 2 weeks later, he threw a 50-pound concrete flower pot at my front door. That was it. I called the police. They told me to get a stalking no-contact order. A few days after that, I was watching TV when a notification popped up on my screen. My neighbor was trying to cast a video to my TV. I declined it. Twice. That was when I filed another police report and started the process of getting the stalking no-contact order. So, I finally went to court with all the evidence I'd collected. Everything from the texts where he called me sweetie and cutie to the ones where I told him flat out that he was making me uncomfortable. I even included the texts where he admitted he knew he was making me uncomfortable. I laid it all out for the judge, including the time I suspected he tried to break into my house while I was out of town. Here's the wild part. He didn't deny any of it. In fact, he told the judge he took full accountability for everything. He said he was in recovery and trying to turn over a new leaf. He didn't even oppose the protection order. So, in March 2020, I was officially granted a stalking no-contact order. For a while, things were quiet. He still did weird stuff, because he's just a weird guy, but it wasn't anything that made me fear for my safety. That is, until he got back on drugs. It started again a couple of months after I began dating my boyfriend. One day, I found an unspent shotgun shell in my flower bed. It looked exactly like the one he'd left before, as a warning. I was pretty sure it was aimed at my boyfriend this time. After that, my boyfriend ended up moving in with me. It was quicker than we planned, but honestly, it worked out great. We're still together and super happy. Then came New Year's 2021. I was jolted awake by screaming outside. I turned on my security cameras and saw him sticking his head out of his window, screaming obscenities at my bedroom window. This went on for 7 minutes. And let me tell you, 7 minutes is a long time when your stalker is yelling threats. He called me a harlot, wished me a happy fucking new year, and even said he was going to blow up his house using his gas line. Of course, I called the police, and guess what they said? Well, he didn't say your name, so we can't prove it's a violation of the protection order. There's nothing illegal about yelling in your own house. They didn't even talk to him, just left. At this point, I was doing everything I could to avoid him. I stopped parking in my driveway since it's so close to his porch. I kept my curtains drawn all the time. I even spent over $1,000 installing 5 security cameras, so every inch of my yard was covered. But his behavior just kept escalating. Neighbors and I would see him talking to people who weren't there or yelling nonsense like, "I have Cheerios on my necklace," or "I'll put my penis in your butt." It was bizarre, but not threatening. Until last week. That morning, I heard screaming again. "Someone is going to die over this sweatshirt." I turned on the cameras. He was pacing around the alley behind my house, yelling things like, "Are you fucking proud? How about I get my shotgun? I'll get everybody all fired up." I called the police, and once again, they said it wasn't a violation of the protection order. Instead, they gave him an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. The officer told me, "It seems like he's off his medication again." And that was it. They left. Then, last night, I was woken up at 1 a.m. by hammering. When I turned on the cameras, I saw him outside, cutting down his privacy fence, horizontally. I called the police for a noise complaint, and they told him to stop. That was it. No charges, no warnings, just stop. This morning, I saw that he finished the job. His privacy fence now stands at a whopping 3 feet tall. That fence was the one thing that made me feel safe enough to hang out in my backyard, and now it's gone. So, here I am, writing this because I'm just tired. I just want to live in a house where I don't have to worry about my neighbor trying to kill me or break in. My boyfriend and I are trying to buy a new place, but it's hard. I'm a PhD student, so I don't make much money. Renting isn't an option because I have 4 cats, and with my boyfriend's cat and dog, finding a rental that allows 6 animals, forget it. My dad has agreed to co-sign on a new mortgage, and I've picked up a second job. Hopefully, we can save enough to move in a few months. But until then, I'm stuck here. I don't know what else to do. I'm tired. I'm angry. And honestly, I just needed to vent. All right, so let me set the scene for you. I live in a big city in Eastern Europe, but it's not exactly the safest place. My neighborhood gets a bad rap. People always talk about how sketchy it is. But honestly, I've never run into any serious trouble. Sure, we've got vandals and your usual troublemakers, but nothing that ever felt, dangerous. I'm still a teenager and live with my parents, but growing up here has taught me how to be street smart, which has definitely come in handy. And as it turns out, that instinct saved me from a pretty creepy situation today. So, it's around 3 p.m., and my dad heads out to his ping pong practice. He's usually gone until 8 p.m. because he always grabs a beer with his friends afterward. Meanwhile, my mom and brother are out helping one of my friends clean up after a New Year's party. I was supposed to go with them, but I wasn't feeling great. Okay, technically, I was super hungover, but my mom doesn't need to know that. Anyway, I stayed home. Looking back, that was probably the luckiest decision I've ever made. You'll see why in a second. Now, I've been home alone plenty of times before, so it's not a big deal for me. But because I've spent way too much time reading creepy stories online, I've started taking more precautions when I'm by myself. Double-checking that the door's locked, turning off unnecessary lights, stuff like that. The evening was totally normal. I was rewatching some episodes of Skins, UK version obviously, when I decided I needed a snack. Behind my apartment complex, there's this supermarket that's my go-to for late-night cravings. It's only about a 5-minute walk, so I threw on my coat and flip-flops and headed out. It was freezing cold, like icy, but the bright lights of the supermarket were up ahead, and everything seemed fine. Except something felt off. Right in front of the automatic doors, there was this small, stocky guy standing there, almost like he was guarding the place. As I got closer, I realized I'd seen him before. He was always hanging around our block, just kind of existing. I never paid much attention to him, but now he was standing there, dressed poorly, staring at the doors. I asked him if the supermarket was still open, and he just pointed at a piece of paper clipped next to the schedule. Turns out, it had closed early, 6 p.m., because of the holiday season. It was already 6:20. I sighed, annoyed, and started to turn back toward home. But then he spoke up. "Hey, there's a boutique nearby," he said, almost too eagerly. His voice was weird, urgent. He kept insisting that it was just a 2-minute walk from here, staring at me the whole time. That was my first red flag. Still, I brushed it off. I told myself he was probably just trying to be helpful, maybe hoping I'd give him some money as a thank you or something. It kind of made sense, but I stayed on high alert anyway. So, I went to the boutique. I grabbed the first snack I could find, paid quickly, wished the shop owner a happy new year, and got out of there as fast as I could. By the time I was walking back, I was starting to feel more and more nervous. I didn't have any specific reason to be. It was just this gut feeling, like something wasn't right. And then I noticed something that made my heart drop. When I passed the supermarket again, the guy was gone. He had been standing there when I left, but now, nothing. Nowhere to be seen. That's when I panicked. I started jogging toward my apartment, my brain racing to come up with logical explanations. Maybe he just left. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. So, I got to the front of my building, and that's when I saw him. In the distance, through my short-sighted eyes, I could make out a tall, dark figure stepping into the elevator. And almost like it was planned, the automatic light switched off. Panic set in. I ran for the intercom, fumbling with my keys, desperate to get the door open. My mind was racing, but I managed to get inside. I looked toward the elevator. It was still moving. Watching the numbers light up, I saw it stop on the 5th floor. Okay, I thought. At least he didn't go all the way up to my floor. But I wasn't about to take any chances. Instead of waiting for the elevator, I took the stairs. At first, I felt a little silly, like maybe I was overreacting. But as I climbed the stairs, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The light on the 6th floor was on. Weird, I thought, but I kept walking. Then, as I got closer to my floor, I saw the light on the 7th floor switch on. I froze. Whoever it was, they weren't going to the 8th floor. They were on mine. I stood there for what felt like forever, hoping the light would turn off or they'd move on. But it didn't. That's when I decided to just go for it. I ran up the stairs, heart pounding, and when I reached my floor, I almost passed out from what I saw. There he was, the tall, dark figure, kneeling at my doorknob, trying to lockpick my door. I panicked. I didn't feel angry or brave. I just wanted this to stop. From a distance, I managed to choke out a weak, "Hey!" He turned around so fast, I barely had time to process it. And when I saw his face, my stomach dropped. He was wearing a long black trench coat, a hat, and leather gloves. His face was pale, his yellow, crooked teeth showing as he smiled at me. Not a friendly smile, a menacing one, like he was enjoying the fear on my face. You know that gut-wrenching feeling when something is so wrong, so out of this world, that you can't look away even though you want to? That was exactly how I felt, times 1,000. I was frozen, but then, to my surprise, he bolted. He muttered a quick, "Sorry," and ran for the stairs. I just stood there, completely paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't call the police, nothing. When I finally worked up the courage to walk to my door, I saw a pin still stuck in the lock. Yep, he was definitely trying to break in. Who knows what he would have done if he'd gotten inside. My parents weren't going to be home for another 2 hours, and I didn't know whether to call them or the cops first. Looking back, I'm almost sure the man from the supermarket and this guy were working together. It was all way too convenient. Him distracting me while his buddy tried to break in. One thing's for sure. I'm keeping a bat in my room from now on. So much for New Year's resolutions. After I managed to snap out of it, I called my parents. They said they'd head home immediately and told me to call the cops as soon as we hung up. They also contacted a sweet neighbor on the 2nd floor to come up and keep me company until the police arrived. When the officer showed up, I explained everything. I showed him the lockpick pin, which he took as evidence, and I gave him a detailed description of the guy from the supermarket and the lockpicker himself, though that part was harder since everything was a blur. Thankfully, the officer was really nice. He said they'd leave some patrols in the area to keep an eye out. I guess I got lucky. Around here, the police aren't usually that helpful. Back in 2018, I moved into this little 2-story house in England with my then boyfriend. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac with the houses crammed together, all facing each other. Pretty cozy setup. Now, I'm super introverted, so I don't typically go out of my way to socialize with neighbors. Still, you exchange a polite hello here and there. It's just what you do, right? One of our neighbors, Greg, made it his mission to be the friendliest guy in the world. He was older, the kind of guy who'd stop you for a quick chat that would drag on forever until you made up an excuse to escape. He loved sharing random stories about the area and always remembered little details, like birthdays. He even invited us to a garden party where apparently anyone was welcome. His house was directly across from ours, so his windows had a clear view of mine. At first, it was harmless. Just a friendly neighbor. Fast forward a couple of years, though, and things changed. My boyfriend and I broke up. I didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood, but word must have gotten around. His car was gone, and it was pretty obvious. He ended up moving out of the country, but we stayed friends and kept in touch. Living alone felt weird. Lonely, honestly. So, I got a cat for company, and he quickly became my world. Meanwhile, Greg ramped up his habit of flagging me down for random chats every time he saw me leave or come home. It was annoying, but I tolerated it. I'd text my ex about Greg's antics sometimes. We'd laugh about it because, let's be honest, they were so weird. Like the time Greg came over to drop off 2 parcels of mine, including a big table that he'd left at his house for some reason. I was in the middle of an intense online raid in Elder Scrolls and told him to just leave the table by the door. Instead, he let himself in. I was wearing my headset, focused on the final boss, when I heard the door open, followed by heavy footsteps approaching me. When I turned around, Greg was standing there, staring at me. I couldn't just stop playing. I'd have let my whole raid team down, so I kept going until we finished. Once the boss was down, I took off my headset, and Greg's face lit up like I'd just done something miraculous. "That was amazing," he said, like he'd never seen anyone use a keyboard in his life. He started rambling about how I should teach him to play, and even though I tried to politely laugh it off, he wouldn't leave. He was clearly drunk, so I figured that's why he wasn't taking the hint. Eventually, I had to literally walk over to the door, open it, and stand there waiting for him to get the message. He finally left, but looked genuinely disappointed. That wasn't the only odd thing Greg did. In the UK, everyone has their own outdoor bins for trash, and you're supposed to wheel them out the night before collection and bring them back afterward. I noticed someone kept bringing my bins back in for me, and I wondered if I was being too slow and blocking someone's car. At the same time, I realized someone was using my bins. One day, I casually mentioned it to Greg during one of his impromptu driveway chats, and he said the same thing had been happening to him. I didn't totally buy it, so I taped an old phone with a surveillance app to my window to catch whoever it was. Guess who it turned out to be? Greg. I figured maybe he'd run out of space in his bins. Our collections had recently been reduced to every other week. It annoyed me, but I decided to let it go. Confrontation wasn't worth it. Then, Christmas rolled around, right in the middle of the pandemic. Late one evening, there was a knock at my door. No peephole, so I opened it, and there was Greg. Nothing unusual so far. I'd gotten used to his random visits, but the strong smell of alcohol hit me immediately. "I have a Christmas present for you," he said, holding out a red gift bag stuffed with tissue paper. Before I could thank him, he said, "I really want to give you a kiss on the cheek, but I can't. not with the pandemic and all. That alone gave me the creeps, but I smiled politely and tried to end the conversation quickly. He wasn't having it. He started rambling, and I firmly told him I was busy and needed to go. Then he stepped closer, put a hand on my shoulder, leaned in, and kissed my cheek. I just froze. Before I could even process what had happened, he turned around and walked back to his house like nothing was wrong. I closed the door and just stood there, trying to make sense of it all. The gift Greg gave me was weird, to say the least. Inside the tissue paper were 2 bottles of Belgian beer, a half-eaten can of sour cream and onion Pringles, and a little plastic bag of chocolates. And here's the kicker. I recognized the chocolates. A few weeks earlier, my next-door neighbors, the ones with young kids, had gone around delivering these exact little chocolate bags with handwritten notes, wishing everyone a Happy New Year. They were clearly homemade gifts meant to keep their stir-crazy kids entertained during lockdown. Greg hadn't even bothered to remove the note before re-gifting them to me. The whole thing felt so off, especially after the unsolicited kiss. I regretted ever opening the door. That was the moment I decided I was done playing Miss Polite. I'd start being firm about my boundaries from now on. 2 days into the new year, I was feeling lazy and ordered food delivery. Barely 5 minutes after my food arrived, there was a knock at the door. My stomach sank. I knew it wasn't the delivery driver, so it had to be Greg. And then it hit me. This wasn't a coincidence. He always seemed to show up right after something was delivered. He was watching my house. I froze, too uncomfortable to answer, and retreated upstairs, out of sight from the windows. Later that night, he came back and started knocking again, but I ignored him. I hoped he'd give up and go away. The next day, I decided to contact the police. I felt silly. Was this really harassment? Maybe he was just a lonely old man, and I hadn't been clear enough. Still, I wanted it on record in case things escalated. When the officer asked if I wanted them to speak to Greg, I said no. I thought I could handle it myself. I'd later be very glad I filed that report. A few days after that, Greg showed up at my door again, saying he was worried about me. I stood firm and told him, "I think it's best if we don't have any contact going forward." His response gave me chills. "I just wanted to be your friend." I didn't engage further. I ended the conversation and closed the door. Finally, this is over, I thought. For a while, it seemed like I was right. A year passed without incident. No knocks, no awkward conversations when I was outside. Everything felt normal. Until one winter night. I was leaving my house to grab groceries. It was pitch dark outside, except for a single lamppost casting faint light across the street. My driveway, tucked along the side of my house, was enclosed by a tall panel fence for privacy. As I locked the door, I noticed something. A shadow slipping out of my driveway, ducking behind the fence. My gut screamed at me. I immediately unlocked the door and went back inside. I told myself I could have imagined it. It was dark after all, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been waiting for me. I skipped the groceries that night and installed a motion sensor light the next day. The light made me feel a little safer, but the unease lingered. A couple of months later, I was in my kitchen feeding my cat. The motion sensor light turned on. I glanced outside but didn't see anything at first. Then, in the bottom corner of the window, something caught my eye. It wasn't fully illuminated, so I squinted, trying to make it out. I stared at it for what felt like forever. The light stayed on, and then Greg popped up. He had been crouched down, peering into my kitchen window. I'm usually calm in stressful situations, but I completely lost it. I screamed, "What are you doing?" over and over. Greg didn't flinch. He just stood there and casually asked, "Are you all right?" I screamed again, "Why are you there?" He said nothing and walked off into the dark. I called the police immediately. To my surprise, they took it seriously. I gave them my statement and was told Greg was already known to them for following young women. They even arrested him at his house, right in front of a wife I didn't even know he had. Unfortunately, all he got was a police caution. He was forbidden from coming to my side of the cul-de-sac or contacting me. It seemed to work. That was the last major incident with Greg, though I did catch him staring at me from his window while I was in the shower once. I'd forgotten to close the blinds. Since then, I've moved far, far away, and I can only hope I never meet someone like Greg again.